I'm Robert Crighton, and welcome to This Is... the first episode of a podcast about things what happened in any particular year. And the year in question this episode is 1583. Ta-da! It's not a year that you might know very much about. I'm not sure it's one of those classier vintages. It might be more a wine you set aside for cooking with later. But as ever, when you dig about a little into any specific year, you'd be amazed what you find underneath the surface. To chat about this year, 1583, and what's going on in England and the world of theatre is...
Hello, I'm Helen Good and a historian, and I've been asked if I were in England in 1583, what I'd like to see. And I'd like to be a fly on the wall in a Privy Council meeting because I want to understand how the country was actually being run. And if it was in term time and on a Wednesday or a Friday, I would stay for the lunch and then see how they managed the Court of Star Chamber in the afternoon.
Hello, I'm Stephen Longstaffe, and it tells you rather a lot about me, I suppose. I'd like to look at two buildings, if I'm allowed to. And one is Old St. Paul's. So St. Paul's before the Great Fire of London, where sermons took place in the open air, where the interior of the church was used for all sorts of things, not to do with religion. Churches behaved completely differently in those days. And there were a lot of booksellers around there too. So I'd like to visit that. And the other place I'd like to go to is Revo Abbey in Yorkshire, which by then had been wrecked by Henry VIII's Reformation. I go to these places and look at them and imagine what they would have been like. And the reason I want to go to Revo, as opposed to any of the other great ruins, is that they were operating a blast furnace at this point. They had a furnace going continually, and I would just love to go to somewhere that had been a great monastic house and see what it was like to be there while it was also a huge industrial site. I just love the juxtaposition of heavy industry and faded glories. So I'd like to see what that would look like.
Hello, I'm Daniel Yabut, and if I were in England in 1583, I'd like to follow the rehearsal process from page to stage to printer and back around again.
And these are our visitors to the year 1583 today. So many questions. Where do we start? It's our first episode. We need to establish some sort of playing field as to what's going on. So we're going to start generally in England. It is the past. It is a strange and alien place where there's a queen called Elizabeth on the throne and everyone is miserable. Helen, I'm going to ask you to start at the relative top of the political tree. What's going on at court? What's going on politically? How long has Elizabeth been about? What is going on in 1583?
Well, 1583, Elizabeth had been queen for 25 years and she was 50 years old. She was unmarried and childless, and so in dynastic terms, she was a complete failure. The Tudors were a 3-generation dynasty, which is not, I think it's fair to say, what any of them had been hoping for. England was at peace, the pandemics were containable, the harvests were reasonable, the export of wool had given way to the new cloth trade, coal and metal industries and Stephen's blast furnace were growing in value. The government was spending as little as possible on governing and consequently was usually broke. Tax collection, customs collection was utterly inefficient, and double entry bookkeeping was an Italian fad that no proper Englishman would use. The nobles and the keener Protestants were urging the Queen to assist the Dutch rebels, the Dutch Protestant rebels against Catholic Spain, and she gave way to them 2 years later, which led to a very long and expensive war. In the meantime, by 1583, a new wave of missionary Jesuit priests, the seminary priests, was arriving in England. And if one of them inspired the death of the Queen, there would definitely have been a civil war.
Excellent. I've got written in my script witty response here, which I'm now going to endeavour to come up with. I mean, one of the great things I think Elizabeth did manage to achieve, especially following on from the previous two monarchs, is that she wasn't dead yet. Longevity seems to be one of the really important aspects to Elizabeth, especially when we're talking about this sort of religious swings of the pendulum that had been going on through Edward and Mary before her. So she, being an established figure that's lasted this period of time, there is some continuity as well as change going on. I'm not sure if that's witty. That felt like more a statement than a question.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Helen, do you know any more about how real the threats to Elizabeth's life were around this time? Had that really started by this point, or was it a bit later on?
Burghley kept, William Cecil, the First Lord Burghley, kept a file of them, which is still fairly well intact in the Lansdowne papers. You can think of it as the green ink letters. There were an awful lot of people who were complete fruitcakes and were absolutely determined to kill her. There were attempts. There was an attempt by a priest. The Jesuits themselves claimed that they went around from country house to country house urging people not to blow up the legislature with gunpowder. But she had been excommunicated by the Pope in 1570, and she was in danger because Mary, Queen of Scots in 1583 was still alive, and she was in the centre of England, and she could have just walked in, and she was Catholic.
So we've got a sense, perhaps, just a little pen portrait now of what's going on there at the top of the tree. That's the Queen and the Court a little bit. But let's move a little closer to our day job on Beyond and talk about the theatre scene. We have a fairly well-developed theatrical scene around about us at this time. Not only have we got purpose-built playhouses, we have found spaces, we have a network of possible venues up and down the country. So I'll just pass over to Stephen. What's the entertainment scene like around this time, and do you have any general thoughts about theatre at this time?
Well, I should, I suppose, preface what I'm going to say by saying that all my general thoughts come from one particular book, which is a wonderful book that's come out recently called The Masters of the Rebels, Elizabeth I Court Theatre by William Gager, who completely changed what I thought about all of that stuff, which is why I'm so excited about it. It's a pivotal point. And it would have been seen as a pivotal point in its own time as well, which is interesting because often these things become obvious later on. But the key element is that we have a closely developing interaction between a professional theatre scene based in London. So there are something like 10 venues come on stream in London from the middle of the 1570s through to the end of the decade. Boys, specific to boys' companies, we have inns, and we have purpose-built theatres, including the theatre, which is generally regarded to be the first one. And the reason this happens is very modern phases of outsourcing and downsizing with regard to the court, because the court was broke. Elizabeth was perennially broke. And Burghley, who Helen's already introduced, was always trying to save money. And one of the things was court entertainments were horrendously expensive. So a season at court would cost you, at this point, it would cost you something like 600 or 700 quid. 15 years later, when these reforms and changes had taken place, it would cost a tenth of that. And the outsourcing is basically, instead of court entertainments being the business entirely of an officer of the court, involving all sorts of massive multimedia, huge expense, they started doing plays because plays were so much cheaper. But they didn't want to pay the full cost of that. So what they used to do was, what they did end up doing was establishing theatre companies which would make their money round about London or touring, and then they would be ready to do the entertainments at court cut price. And so we have a period where that is just consolidating. Now they can finally make money and be independent. And all of this is under the direction of a figure called the Master of the Revels, who is crucially involved in the setting up of a well-known company set up in 1583, which is the Queen's Men. Elizabeth had a royal company, which she inherited from her sister, Mary, and who inherited it from Edward, their brother. And it kind of run down over the years. So she started her reign with the Queen's Men. She didn't really want anything to do with them. They kind of waited for the last of those Queen's Men to die out, which took 25 years. And then they went, right, what can we do? And so the Queen's Men were born in 1583.
We're going to be talking a little bit more about Queen's Men in a moment. Any follow-up on those thoughts that anyone wants to throw in? It's that element of the conceit for so many for almost all theatrical activity is that, you know, in theory you're playing it before the Queen. All public performances on some level a dress rehearsal for that potential eventuality as an idea. I find it really interesting.
I think it's important to talk about the plays, or at least to recenter how we think about plays during this time period, from focus on who the playwright is to who the playing company is. And I think that Stephen introduced the subject well, because during this time period, you're going to have a mix of title pages that more often than not will disclose who played the play, who the playing company was versus who the playwright was.
And we're, as I say, we've decided to centre on 1583 and the question of what plays do we think might have been performed this year. And, well, we don't have... it's very hard at this point to absolutely nail down performances for a lot of plays. We have one I think we can be fairly certain on, which is a version of Dido. We have two which could orbit in give or take a year or so. We have Fedele and Fortunio and Compasbe by John Lilly, Fedele and Fortunio by Anthony Munday, which we have looked at on the YouTube channel. Links will be in the show notes if you'd like to dive into those plays a little bit more. Other plays and other lost things are available that might have been landing on this year, but those are, broadly speaking, the three that we might be able to land on for this particular session. So with a bit of focus on possible surviving plays from 1583, is there any interesting textual history on any of these, Dan?
Well, I wanted to hit first on the point that you just said, surviving plays. I think that's really the key point whenever talking about early modern plays, whether you're talking about from 1583 or from 1593, 1594, when all of a sudden we have a glut of print publications on the market there. David McInnes is probably the foremost expert on this. I would consult his books on lost plays or on the website on it. But I'll basically say that of the 3,000 play titles that we know of from the early modern period, we're talking, 1560 to 1642, we've got about, maybe 600 or so in print or in manuscript form. So that tells you a very small percentage of these plays do exist. And so from 1583 in particular, it's true, we have about 8 or so known titles that look to have been performed that year, but none of which were actually printed that year. In fact, on record, it appears that no plays were printed that year. If you were to look at, for example, Martin Wiggins's volumes on it. This does not mean that did not happen, that no plays were printed. I would say it's probably a safer assumption that they're just no longer extant. If you start to look at some of the other years, in 1581, we have evidence of 14 unique play titles printed, but 10 of them were in Seneca's 10 Tragedies, a volume. So in 1582, we have one whole edition printed. 1584, 1585, we got 4 and 4 of each of those years. So that's just to give you an idea of when we're talking about, maybe nothing was printed that year or no plays actually happened. I think they did happen. We just don't know what they were, unfortunately. On the plays that we do know about, the first one, yes, is William Gager's Dido. That's probably the best known of the titles in terms of Dido, is obviously a well-known quantity. It's the earliest known and extant Dido that was introduced during the Elizabethan period. In comparison, Christopher Marlowe's Dido, by most accounts, did not debut for another 4 to 10 years. It was not printed until 1594, I believe. Gager's Dido exists in 2 manuscripts, one of which seems to be a full transcript at Christ Church, Oxford, and the other one is a holographic transcript in the British Library of extracts. The second play is of the first known publication of John Lyly, that would be Campaspe. It's important to note that Lyly was not an unknown quantity at the time, in fact. He was already known for his prose works, namely Euphues, or The Anatomy of Wit in 1578. It was published 5 times by 1581. And so Campaspe was performed by Oxford's Boys and Blackfriars, as well as by them and the Children of the Chapel Royal in 1584. And it was also apparently a popular title because it was reprinted at least 4 more times between 1584 and 1632. So, and interestingly, it went to press 3 times in 1584 with 2 different title pages, one of which called it the most excellent comedy of Alexander, Campaspe, and Diogenes, while the second and all future impressions dubbed it simply Campaspe. So you can look at this printing as well as another printing of Sappho and Fowl by Lyly in 1584. They were both printed by Thomas Dalston for Thomas Cadman, and they both closely resemble each other. Sappho and Fowl was maybe known to you if you're a fan of Lyly, or also because the prologue was recycled in Beaumont's Night of the Burning Pestle in 1635. They also closely resemble each other in terms of title page, to ornaments, to textual layout. And finally, third have been by another major playwright, Anthony Munday, best known, of course, for the manuscript play, The Book of Sir Thomas More. This may have been his play publishing debut, as he was often given credit for Fedele and Fortunio, a translation adaptation of a modern continental play, Il Fedele. So that was the only known printed edition of this was in 1585. And this follows in a tradition, as I mentioned from Seneca earlier, the 10 of Seneca's plays translated. And it preceded the translations by Thomas Kidd and the Countess of Pembroke, their translations of Garnier. When we talked about this, as Rob had mentioned, we discussed this for Beyond Shakespeare. There was a fair amount of debate over what this play really was about and whether it should be taken seriously, whether it was a misogynistic play or a moralizing play.
I think I should definitely jump in there. We recorded it over 3 sessions. We were sort of enjoying the first session, and then we started feeling uncomfortable in the second. By the third, we were really not sure where to go.
Right. Yeah. So there was a great bit of debate on whether we liked this play or not, and what it really was about, and whether it would sell today. I bring this up now because the attribution to Munday may cue us in. It's his initials, or the initials MA, maybe a variant of AM in the epistle, are one of the reasons why we attribute it to Munday. Now, Munday was known also for translating a number of other continental works. So as Amadeus de Gaulle, Palmendos, etc. These were all seemingly interested in contributing to the cultural debates on agency, in particular female agency, as well as marriage, sexuality, religion, colonialism. If this play, Fedele and Fortunio, was indeed translated, or adapted rather, by Munday, he was adapting an Italian play that seemed to be a revenge play against, because he was written by a spurned lover. Whereas Munday's play seems to have a well-rounded out female character surrounded by a bunch of commedia dell'arte archetypes. And by the end, a happy solution is found for everyone. I bring this up because this fits in more of the idea that this might have been a satirical play, if Munday indeed was a translator or adapter, to fit in with the tradition of his other translations that he did indeed do there. So that's up for debate. The last play I will bring up is actually a Latin play, Ricardus Tertius, which I believe we actually had talked about when discussing the True Tragedy of Richard III. University plays don't often seem to get discussed when we're talking about professional plays, but I would argue that perhaps they should enter the discussion more often, as these playwrights or these plays seem to be pretty well known by, at least in some circles, as playwrights of the genre are often discussed by professional playwrights.
The reason why you might not find that on the YouTube channel, and also the reason why we haven't done a reading of Dido, or this particular Dido that we're talking about, is of course it's in Latin, which is an important point that we should bring up as to the limits of what we can and cannot do at this time. But we hopefully will be able to touch on that a little further on. Now, we've mentioned a few of the possible plays that might have been happening in 1583. Now, none of those are necessarily associated with the Queen's Men that was mentioned by Stephen earlier. Well, there might be at least one text that we can associate with the Queen's Men, but we might talk about that a little later on. So we've mentioned the Queen's Men. Let's take a little bit of a dive now into who were they? What makes the Queen's Men perhaps a bit different from other playing companies that we might know of? In fact, someone has just mentioned in the chat, the question of drama being London-centric, and I wonder whether the Queen's Men might be an excellent example of how drama can be not so London-centric. So who were the Queen's Men, and are we on a first-name basis with any of them?
Yes, we have the names of them all, but we don't necessarily know a great deal about some of those people. So before I go into those, there's another name that we should all know, which is Edmund Tilney, who is a holder of an office called the Master of the Revels. And the Revels is basically any kind of court entertainment, not just theatre. And in 1581, Tilney got huge amount of powers over drama in this country. If you wanted to put a play on, you had to basically do it in front of him or send him a script. And Tilney is the prime mover in the creation of the Queen's Men, which he does by taking all the best players out of all the other theatre companies and lumping them into the Queen's Men. So they're kind of like a boy band, and he's the sort of Simon Cowell figure, pulling the strings and getting all these individuals who some of them have very high reputations already, and putting them into one company. So it's completely original in the early part of our period, 16th century, in the sense that everybody in it is a kind of theatrical celebrity. Even some of the people we don't know anything else about were well known enough to get mentioned 20 or 30 years later in passing as being great actors. So the most famous one, the name who's most endured, is a guy called Richard Tarleton, who comes from the Earl of Sussex's company, and Tarleton is the first great English clown, as it were. In fact, he has some claim to have originated the idea that the clown is somebody funny, because the word clown before Tarleton in the period just means somebody from the country who's a bit ignorant. And Tarleton turned this into one of the first great comic personae. But he wasn't just a comedian. He was a dancer. He was a writer. He created ballads. He was a master of fencing, because in those days there was really no way to make your living just simply as somebody who did the dramatic stuff. You needed lots of strings to your bow. And so if you went to see Tarleton, you might go and see him just fighting with somebody. It might be nothing to do with humor at all. And the next most famous one is probably Robert Wilson, whose work as a playwright we've come across. Wilson is also known as a comic performer, and particularly as an improviser. And in fact, I think 5 of the original 12 Queen's Men are known specifically as comic performers. And we're used, if we know anything at all about theatre companies from this period, we have the idea that there's only one of these great comic stars in a company. So there's in the company of 12, they're all celebrities. That's great when you launch. However, 6 years later, when half of your celebrities are dead, which is the case with the Queen's Men, then your USP is starting to wobble a little bit. So the Queen's Men had a very brief period as the topmost of the poppermost, but went into a kind of nosedive fairly rapidly after that. Economically, they were set up to tour in the spring and summer, and the Queen's Men were a large company in terms of royal companies. Henry VII had a royal company, the King's Men, but there were only 4 or 5 people in that. Edward VI Royal Company only had 8. Queen's Men had 12, and one of the reasons it had 12 is that it was set up to split into 2 and tour separately, and that is a great way of generating material. So earlier parts of the year they tour, the later part of the year they end up in London, sort of November, December time, and what they're doing there is making a bit of money from the London professional theatre scene, but they're also getting their act together literally for the court. So there is a distinct yearly cycle to what the Queen's Men are set up to do. They're set up to go around the country, and there's all sorts of reasons why that might have been in the interests of various people at court. I'm a bit skeptical about that. But they're tied into this burgeoning London theatre scene, which at this point, there's no idea that they would just stay there all year round. And then that prepares them for the court revel season, which could go goes to the beginning of Easter usually, and then they're back out again on tour. So it's absolutely baked in that this is not a London-centric scene. London is one of the three prongs of the three-pronged fork. God, this metaphor is going well. Which was the Queen's Men. You have the court, you have the country, and you have London. And the Queen's Men are set up to work all three.
We've the idea that they're building a repertoire, they're building a performance base that they can split and tour, and we've been looking at all of their potential repertoire, acknowledged potential repertoire and more speculative repertoire, and looking at how some of them look like they could be contractable and quite small, and some could be bigger, or at least that's how the scripts come to us. But sadly, most of what we know of as acknowledged Queen's Men repertoire doesn't really come into print. I think it's already been mentioned for another 10 years or so. And then there's this great flourish of titles that we can associate with them. The only play that we might speculatively say is connected to the Queen's Men at this time is a wonderful play, Climon and Climades, that we enjoyed to an enormous degree, of which it is very difficult to date. Some people think it is an incredibly early play that the Queen's Men pick up. And there's an interesting question as if you're a new theatre company, where does your repertoire come from? Is it all new stuff, or are you, as the individuals are drafted into it, are they collecting stuff and carrying it with them? Are they, moonlight flit with their materials? I'm being really speculative here. Do stamp on me. But yeah, it's an interesting question as to when that play emerges, or whether it's written in a slightly more old-fashioned style and it actually is written later. So it might be a play that we could associate with the Queen's Men in this year, 1583. It might not. But as I say, we don't really know of any of the plays they might have been performing now. We know of plays that might appear later. Dan, do you have any thought about the potential plays for the Queen's Men?
That's really the thing about trying to decide what plays you can assign to when you don't have them noted on the title page, as I alluded to earlier. Sadly, of the 17 to 20 Queen's Men plays that we attribute to the Queen's Men, only 11 of them saw publication, and only 7 of them actually list the Queen's Men on the title page. So, and all of them taking place between 1590 and 1600. By the time you get to King Lear in 1605, they're not even listed. That may just be because they didn't want to list them by accident, or maybe because they were just out of fashion and felt like it didn't add anything to it there. So Climon and Climades was printed in 1599, and that was one that was attributed to the Queen's Men. I think for a future podcast, as we start getting into deeper dives into years in which the Queen's Men feature, I think we can start to talk about maybe some of their aesthetics, maybe some of the, if we're able to identify specific patterns or framework or themes that the Queen's Men tends to deal with. I think that would be interesting to do.
Yeah, and a couple of us have said, talking, sort of projecting to the future about where the Queen's Men are going to go, and hopefully, as every time we dive into the next sort of 20 years, that we've got to look into what the impression of what the Queen's Men are up to. There's an interesting question about does their reputation diminish, or does fundamentally the world of theatre get more London-centric? They're primarily a touring network, and it's an interesting question. Do they actually take a bit of a dive in the future in terms of their actual quality and impact across the country, or is it just that that's our impression of what happens to them because documents that we might be able to use are not available because they're not necessarily where we want them to be? We'll leave that to the future episodes of this when we get further into the future of I called them the dirty dozen of theatre companies. You go out there and collect your most dangerous players. Tarleton, we've done quite a lot on the podcast about. I do love a bit of Tarleton. Robert Wilson, less so. We've not been a huge fan of Robert Wilson. We're fascinated by him, but he's not landing in a modern day. Helen.
Yeah, I think we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that people out in the sticks didn't go to London. And they did. There was a tremendous amount of travel over the roads. I'm not talking about everybody, but I have made a study of the aldermen of Hull And it took them 2 days by horse, 2 and a bit sometimes, to get to London. And they were up and down like yo-yos. The merchants, the lawyers, the aldermen, even the mayor at times, whizzing down to interview the Privy Council and to see their lawyers and to borrow money and even sometimes to lend money. So the opportunities for people in the country to have seen a play in London were possibly greater than people think.
If the Queen's men are out on the road, perhaps as, to a degree, her representatives or representatives of various people at court, to be discussed at a future time, I'm sure, they're going on tour around the country. Helen, you've already talked a bit about Elizabeth and the court, and what's going on in the country more generally? Is there more that can be said there?
Well, yes, without going into a sort of gazetteer thing, I think that for the company, there were 2 audiences: the country house set with great halls and the corporate boroughs with inn-yards and guild halls. The corporate boroughs would usually accept respectable companies with the proper paperwork. We know that Lord Leicester's men played in the East Riding Yorkshire town of Beverley, and obviously the Queen's men were quite frequently at York. But we also know that the large town of Hull was not at home to lewd players and devisers of interludes under any circumstances. And this was because they were a Puritan town, as were many of the East Coast towns. They also did not pay the players not to play. Now, Cambridge regularly paid not to hear a play. If you think of an inn-yard holding 240 persons, or on average, or very, very roughly, and those people paid a penny each, and there were then 240 pennies in a pound. So if you took £5, if the company took £5 from a town to go away, that is like the takings from 5 performances and you hadn't had to unpack the carts. I don't think they would have earned more than that, because the innkeeper would have had the catering concessions and the fruit and nuts, as well as the money for the galleries. And certainly at that stage, and I think for quite a long time afterwards, theatre companies weren't selling merch. Now, between the towns and the country houses, there were very bad roads. There was no signposting. There were highwaymen and other less organised robbers. And there was very limited overnight accommodation. And touring would not have been a first choice for me if I had been an actor then.
Just to sort of pick up on the idea of the correct paperwork, and perhaps Helen can correct me here, but the issue with the paperwork is that there was several acts of parliament, but there was a fear of rogues and sturdy beggars on the highways. So basically masterless men, people who didn't have any particular place in a fixed place in the hierarchy. And unless you had the correct paperwork, which means by this point a sign that you had the patronage of quite a major noble figure, then you were considered to be just a bunch of ne'er-do-wells. So you had to. There was a sort of effectively there was a system of internal, passports or ID in place at this point, because of the way that. We shouldn't call it social security, but who was responsible for people? If people were out of their parish or out of their place, then that was a concern in public order terms and in crime terms. So theatre companies did need to be accredited and to have that paperwork with them. Have I got that right, more or less, Helen?
That's my belief, but we've probably read the same books on it.
Well,
I wasn't there. I don't know. I mean,
sure?
none of these letters have survived. We can just assume them from what happened. I mean, people arrived at the town, they would then, it appears, put on a sample for the mayor and corporation and get their permission to play to the populace. And if they didn't do this, the mayor and corporation would go completely apeshit. If they did do it, they might be persuaded just to go away and not play with a small fee.
I do recall at a conference a couple of years ago, someone was talking about the documents being forged as well, while by
yes,
by
I'm sure.
And there is a legitimate point of view from the various corporations and mayors, etc. That especially considering the Queen's Men, the moment they went on tour, they got involved in a terrible bit of business that got them into a certain amount of trouble. Stephen.
Well, just back to the paperwork. The thing that the Queen's Men had that no other company had was that they were entitled to wear the Queen's livery, so that they would turn up basically looking like they'd just come from the court, and that would have been a really big thing in smoothing their way, I think. But that didn't stop them. Didn't stop people getting killed at playhouses, did it?
Yes, as I say, within a couple of months of going on tour, they had slightly murdered someone. So these things happen. Well, that's Norwich for you. Okay, I'm afraid I need to move us forward.
More to the point, they murdered each other.
Yes. But it's not good for business if you start taking out the audience. We move into our wild card section, the session part of the session which is almost certainly going to get cut for the general podcast release, but you never know, you might get lucky. So, Helen, is there anything you'd like to talk about that is a bit random, is what I've got written down here?
Well, I would like to talk about The Watch. It is amazing how many plays The Watchmen turn up and have a very small part, usually comic, usually moving the plot maybe a minuscule amount. But they are truly, almost invariably wonderful people. I'm thinking particularly the Watchman in King Lear and his three daughters. The country is ready for invasion, in this case from France. They are set to watch by the beacon, and unfortunately the beacon is next door to the pub. And as they point out, in all their years of watching by the beacon, it hasn't moved an inch. And they're not stupid. They know the deal. They know what's supposed to be happening. But as soon as authority turns up, they can really act as if they haven't a clue that they weren't supposed to be watching the beacon, they were supposed to be watching the coast. And that is, I think that because I've seen corporate records about drunken watchmen and the rest, I can see that we've got this real connection between what was actually happening and what is happening on the stage. And that is just a small example of many, many other different characterizations of life around them.
Stephen, we had mention about Dido earlier. Do you have anything? I mean, I was talking about it being in Latin, but other versions may be available, and in fact, modern performances may be available. Can you tell us more about Dido?
Well, I was actually involved in a modern performance of it, where a Latin translation of the play was put on in Christ Church Hall, so the original venue for it in Oxford, so the hall of that college, as part of a double bill, as it happens with Marlowe's Dido. So it's about an hour long, and I think the thing that's most interesting about it is it gives you an idea of the full-on spectacular way things could go. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. It was put on for a Polish nobleman called, lots of different versions of his name. Let's call him Lasky, who pitched up in this country in 1583. and managed to be treated as a person of great importance. And so he was living at Winchester House in Southwark, near the Rose, in fact, the Rose Theatre. And he was taken up to Oxford on a barge by the Earl of Leicester, and he was feasted and feted by the University of Oxford, who brought George Peele, who was a recent graduate of Oxford. They brought him back to be the kind of dramaturge for this. And several other kind of famous people were sort of there and thereabouts. Giordano Bruno, the great mathematician and philosopher, who was later burnt at the stake by the Inquisition, I think. When they really pushed the boat out, when they really spent money, this is an eyewitness account of what happens in this play of Dido. So I'll read it out to you. A very stately tragedy named Dido, wherein the Queen's banquet, with Aeneas' narration of the destruction of Troy, was lively described in a marchpane pattern. In other words, they had a big marzipan map of Troy as part of the banquet, because this was put on as part of the banquet, which they took around the room to show people during this. There was also a goodly sight of hunters with full cry of a kennel of hounds. In other words, they brought a hunt into the room. And we have, the reason I say that it was a real hunt brought in is we have examples of this happening at court. They really did keep it real in that respect. We also had Mercury and Iris descending and ascending from and to a high place. This is indoors. A tempest, wherein it hailed small confects, or sweets, I suppose. It rained rose water and snowed an artificial kind of snow. All strange, marvelous, and abundant. And I would add to that, incredibly expensive. And so in an attempt to, this was a special occasion, and what they would do, what the Queen's men were part of, was an attempt to replace this kind of thing with just some guys rocking up and doing a play. And they brought their own costumes and they worked their own scenery out, and they did it all themselves. So that's theatricality. That's the other end of the pole to our idea of the Elizabethan stage as an empty stage, as an empty place onto which the actors brought themselves. They could do full-on CGI Marvel Extended Universe stuff, but they couldn't afford it eventually, and that's how we end up with the theatre industry.
Dan, do you have anything for the wild card question?
I have a note about playwrights and how much they mattered to the marketing of playbooks in 1583. This came about because I noticed that Lilly's name does not appear on Campaspe, doesn't appear on any of his printed playbooks until after he's dead in 1632 in his Six Court Comedies volume there. Yet his name appears on the title page of his off-printed Euphues before he was even known as a playwright. This was from 1579 to 1583, or 1581 rather. So it's been observed that from 1584 to 1593, the following 10 years, that about of the 20 or so professional plays, only one of them actually indicates the playwright's full name, George Peele's Edward I, and it's actually not on the title page, but at the end of the text. So that seems to support the popular theory that, oh, well, no one, the playwright. Doesn't matter who the playwright is, it matters who the playing company is or what the play material is. There's also the initials of Robert Wilson. His initials appear in 2 of those plays during the time period. But over the next 10 years, you've got very popular names, at least to us now: Spanish Tragedy, Tamburlaine, Autumn of Faversham, and all of these are published anonymously. So yes, this does seem to support that theory. But once you start to talk about, for example, Gager, who also had a printed text during that time, if you start to talk about non-professional plays or plays that were of closet dramas or whatnot, you have Andrea, you've got the translation by Maurice Kiffin, you've got Norton and Sackville's Gorboduc. You start to include those titles in there, you start to see the authors' names also pop up more and more often there. And so then I did a little scan of the 5 years or so of the 20 plays that appear the 5 years before 1583. And I believe all of them actually include the playwright's name. So I bring this up, just one more thing. I bring the playing companies, if you start to talk about the playing companies, about half of those 20 or so plays between 1583 and 1594 or 1593, whatever it is, do include the playing company there. All I'm saying is I think that there's an assumption about the value of a playwright's name that I think needs to be reexamined, because you had a popular playwright or a popular prose writer named Lilly who went completely anonymous in his publications for some unknown reason, and a number of popular plays that were not anonymously published, and yet a number of plays that we never talk about do have the names there. So I start to wonder whether it's really this theory that we have is really true.
Okay, I just it's been mentioned in the chat. I mentioned in passing that there's a bit of a murder in Norwich. I will elaborate briefly. I did attempt to have a quick look up the details in the Norwich Read, but it's an incredibly lengthy account. So very, very briefly, what happened was someone tried to get into the show at the Red Lion in Norwich without paying. And a bit of a Barney started, and someone who stepped in to basically say, no, leave it, he's not worth it, gets killed. So it's not even the person who tried to get in without paying who gets killed. It's a chap called George. Apparently, he dies, and two of the playing company they're arrested. They're released a couple of days later, bound over to hold the peace. And then they don't appear for the actual to the court in the future, and it is presumably all sorted out by the next time they tour to Norwich. Stephen.
Which just makes the point that this is a company with some quite powerful protection in a general sense. I'm not saying necessarily in this particular case, but part of the point of the Queen's Men was that there were some very powerful people in the country who wanted them to be able to do what they were doing. And they took on the City of London at different times, and they did other things to make sure that this actually happened. Kind of like the evil faceless corporation that, removes the obstacles from people's way.
Well, I'd love to talk more about that particular case, but I'm sure it will be the subject of a more specifically focused podcast further down the line, because we do have some decent accounts that can be read. Now, we're into final thoughts from around the room. If anyone has any brief final things they want to say that they haven't had time to say. Helen, do you have anything you'd like to close with?
Not really, no, unless you're forcing me, because I have kind of run out.
Excellent. Stephen, are you out of juice too?
Yeah, my bolt was well prepared, but alas, it is shot.
Okay. Dan, do you have anything else?
I'm going to follow suit.
Excellent. So that was 1583, a snapshot of it. There's lots of other things that I'm sure were going on. We might do some sort of follow-up further on, diving into areas that perhaps you're interested in. If you have any questions or thoughts, if we just haven't explicated what was going on in 1583 well enough, then send us a buzz. Email at admin@beyondshakespeare.org or contact us on social media on Twitter and all the other ones at Beyond Shakes, and get involved in the conversation. Ask us for things in the future, and of course when we get on to doing 1584 or 1582 we might be able to squeeze some of those things in. We're not going to go exactly chronologically, by the way. We're going to dance around a bit, but I'm sure we'll get back to those years at a future point. Many thanks to my wonderful guests, Helen Good, Stephen Longstaffe, Daniel Yabut. I've been Robert Crighton, and this is 1583, the year everything changed, except for the stuff that didn't.